Hello, I'm Redmond Bacon, and this is Cinemascapes. After a deeply commercial podcast on apocalypse movies, I've gone the other way and decided to write a two-part episode on Malmkrog, the latest film by Romanian New Wave progenitor Cristi Puiu. In honor of the ways his films start, often with some classical music or simply nothing at all, just showing white text on a black screen, I have opened my podcast with no accompanying music. It sounds less inviting, of course, as it doesn't direct you to a certain preordained mood. But this is the aim. If Puiu is a notoriously difficult director to watch, the only sensible thing is to make this podcast a little difficult to listen to. Malmkrog played 2 months ago at the newly created Encounter section of the Berlinale, which was formed in order to celebrate new forms of filmmaking without the constraints of the competition element. It already seems like a classic Encounters film, taking a dense, difficult approach to adaptation that sticks with an aesthetic and rigidly commits to it. But not only will I be discussing the various multifaceted themes of this dense 200-minute film, adapted from Vladimir Solovyov's 1900 text, Three Conversations about War, Progress, and the End of World History, including a short story of the Antichrist, but I will preface it with a deeper dive into the artist's work. Therefore, this podcast will be split into 2 parts. The first is a broader discussion of Cristi Puiu's work, spanning from Stuff and Dough from 2000 to 2016's Sierra Nevada. From there, I will establish some broader themes. Then in part 2, I will take a closer look at Malmkrog itself, which I have seen twice now and still feel like I am not getting any closer to its key, fascinating meanings. As the film itself is basically a filmed, quasi-platonic dialogue, it only makes sense that I should structure this analysis like a dialogue myself, and will dedicate the majority of part 2 to a conversation with another critic, Joseph Owen. Let's start with part 1, shall we? The Romanian New Wave. Puiu is best known as the father of the Romanian New Wave, which was said to have kicked off in earnest with The Death of Mr. Lazarescu, which won the Uncertain Regard Prize in Cannes in 2005, paving the way for Cristian Mungiu's Palme d'Or success with 4 months, 3 weeks and 2 days just 2 years later. Now the Eastern European nation can boast a variety of successes across the 21st century, such as the blistering work of Radu Jude, especially I Do Not Care If We Go Down in History as Barbarians, which won the Crystal Globe at Karlovy Vary, the controversial Touch Me Not by Adina Pintil, which won the 2018 Golden Bear at the Berlinale, and Corneliu Porumboiu's widely influential Police Adjective. It was a revolution in realism, inspired by decidedly non-Romanian filmmakers, as critic Andrei Gorzo lays out in a speech he gave to the BFI. Observational documentarists Frederick Wiseman and Raymond Depardon became 2 of Puiu's acknowledged models, alongside actor-director John Cassavetes, famous for the intense, volatile interactions among his actors, captured by a camera in the direct cinema mode. They can't be said to be positive films, yet they contain humanism in spades, offering key questions about the nation as it transformed from the totalitarian regime of Nicolae Ceausescu to the modern day, where corruption still runs rampant, infrastructure is wanting, and the same forms of institutional failure have come to the fore, albeit in different guises. History repeats itself again and again and again. The effects of this film movement is complemented by other trends in Eastern European cinema, whether it's the handheld moral dramas of Russian director Yuri Bykov, or recent Serbian films such as Stitches and Father. Even America has seemed to catch the bug. Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always is a riff on 4 months, and The Assistant has that kind of bureaucratic oppressiveness characteristic of Romanian New Wave cinema. The Death of Mr. Lazarescu, which slowly depicts the death of one man thanks to the uncaring indifference of tens of different healthcare professionals, is a case in point. Told with rigorous detail and unforgiving pace by Puiu, it was widely acclaimed upon its release to be a one-of-a-kind masterpiece, and one of the films that really put the Romanian New Wave on the map. It is one of Puiu's proposed 6 stories set on the outskirts of Bucharest. This was to be his answer to Eric Rohmer's Moral Tales, a humanist exploration of the choices people make and the ways in which they justify those decisions. So far, he has delivered 3 of these tales, Lazarescu, Aurora, and Sierra Nevada, with Malmkrog a sharp diversion from such themes. We will be discussing a large chunk of his career so far, looking at Stuff and Dough, the short Cigarettes and Coffee, Lazarescu, of course, Aurora, and Sierra Nevada, giving one the essential prologue to the knotty, complicated themes of his latest film, Malmkrog. I could not find his very first film, a 52-minute documentary named July 13th to July 19th, 1998, Craiova, the retirement home, but his debut, Stuff and Dough, is on YouTube, making for probably his most accessible feature. Likewise, I've ignored his contribution to an anthology film about Sarajevo and his 3 exercises in interpretation. For obvious reasons I will later explain. Anyway, let's dive into this work now. Up first, Stuff and Dough. This is a 90-minute morality tale that is something like Steven Spielberg's Jewel meets Nicholas Winding Refn's Pusher, a very typical low-budget debut feature. Made with limited resources and only a handful of settings, it's the film I would recommend of his to the average person, and by that I mean the kind of person who understandably doesn't want to watch a depressing 3-hour movie. The story is very simple. A local countryside gangster visits a man at an apartment where his parents are running a small, presumably illegal kiosk. He tells this man to bring medical supplies to Bucharest. Why? Don't ask questions. Already for this director, we get this sense of protracted beginnings. It takes an awful while for the guy to get out of the apartment and into the van, even though it's mid-morning and he has to be there by 4 p.m. To make matters even more complicated, he brings along his friend and his girlfriend. Then things get even worse when they are chased by a completely menacing red SUV. The jump cuts in the car instantly bring to mind Godard's Breathless, and there is a sense of utter freedom in the freewheeling nature of these scenes, first made up of unassuming conversations, then spinning into a tightly wound thriller. With the cameraman sitting in the back seat, it feels like a whole aesthetic, panning from left to right to left again from a fixed point, has been discovered as a matter of necessity. Here we can already see some themes that recur throughout Puiu's work. The sense of a quest that we don't know exactly where it's going, a sense of a mystery and also a foreboding, and hypermasculine men who are wounded and wound up by their own sense of puffed up performance. It brings to mind, in some ways, Alfonso Cuarón's Y Tu Mamá También, which also used the road movie to explore the nation. Likewise, we get a panoramic view of Romania, new and old, just sitting outside the car window. A fascinating narrative debut indeed, and rewarding for its sense of adventure that has more or less eluded his later, more fixed, more aesthetically stringent works. Up next, Cigarettes and Coffee. Short movies can often be the most illuminating. This is especially true for Puiu's 15-minute Cigarettes and Coffee, not to be confused with the Jim Jarmusch film, which won Best Short at the Berlinale in 2004. The issues of Romania pre- and post-fall of the Berlin Wall are thrown into sharp relief by the father-son dynamic here, which has a different title in Romanian, Un cartus de Kent si un pachet de café, which I guess, in my terrible pronunciation, means a carton of Kent cigarettes and a packet of coffee. A father asks his son for help. He is a bureaucrat of some sort and can make things happen. The father has to find a new job, and in order to secure that, he has to bribe his own son. But his biggest mistake, bringing instant coffee instead of properly ground stuff. The son is totally detached, acting totally un-son-like. Puiu's framing is more or less detached here too, keeping things pretty simple. It's a piercing, cynical insight into modern Romania, blaming both the father for doing things like in the communist era and the son for reinventing the same stereotypes once again, but just in a new guise. A small work, but an interesting statement of intent. Along with the short Traffic by Cătălin Mitălescu, it was said to be one of the instigating works of the Romanian New Wave. Up next, his undisputed masterpiece, The Death of Mr. Lazarescu. A man feels sick and calls an ambulance. It takes an age to arrive. Later it takes an age for him to be carted off to hospital, where bureaucrat after bureaucrat, consultant after consultant, don't really want much to do with him. Over the course of the movie, which lasts an exhausting 150 minutes, we watch him die possibly the most brutal death in the history of cinema. In many ways, this film is his most successful because it is so conventional. It has a fixed drive from beginning to end, with the fixed ending of the movie, set in the title, bringing to mind the death of Ivan Ilyich by Tolstoy, and its similar depressing exploration of a man's slow demise, but this time at the hand of an unforgiving system. As a result, it's quite easy to find one's footing in this movie. This is his undisputed masterpiece, a slyly black comedy that indicts a system that simply doesn't work whatsoever. It touched a nerve in the country for sure. I actually used to work in the healthcare industry and promoted a healthcare event, and part of that required going to universities and doing workshops to get people to come. And I did a workshop at the Carol de Villa University of Medicine and Pharmacy in Bucharest, and while the students were brilliant, super smart, and had embarrassingly good English, especially compared to my Romanian, they did complain a lot that the system was more or less broken, making the death of Mr. Lazarescu something like the nation's I, Daniel Blake, a cry for radical change right now. Next up, his most difficult film, Aurora. Imagine Taxi Driver without the Bernard Herrmann score, without Robert De Niro, without, you're talking to me, without the porno cinemas, without the shootout at the end, and you may come close to something approximating the depressing aura of Aurora. It seems that Puiu didn't even want to trust actors on this one to deliver the truly psychopathic yet undirected Bresson-like performance of Violet, casting himself as the passive-aggressive murderer who argues with all and sundry and has little to like about him whatsoever. It is, like many of Puiu's films, long, but it feels longer than anything else he has ever made. It's deliberately anti-cinematic. Motivation is not really considered. There is no drive, unlike in Lazarescu, towards death. Instead, it's just something that happens, and then there's more and more and more. Nonetheless, there is actually a fair bit of comedy in this film. The passive-aggressive nature of Violet sees him arguing with pharmacists, colleagues, police officers, all about deeply trivial things. We are often caught up, moment to moment, in greatly acted scenes, which make parts of the movie entertaining in and of themselves, but what it ends up as is completely beyond me. One assumes that's the point. This is a fuck you filmmaker, basically. As he told the Film Stage in an interview, people are free to leave the cinema when they wish. If you know my films, you know I couldn't care less about this fact. Nonetheless, the final revelation is a brilliant one, and maybe justifies the non-event filming of this film, which brings to mind Chantal Akerman at her most obtuse. It turns out that this is not a man driven by anything particularly profound, instead seeing his own petty concerns manifest in the most disgusting of ways. Is that worth 3 hours of almost nothingness? I don't know. Next up, Sierra Nevada. This film is all bustle, no hustle, a blundering family portrait rendered with love, care, attention, and endless conversations. It's a panoramic view of contemporary life as rendered through the view of one uniquely dysfunctional family. As Tolstoy once said, each unhappy family is unhappy in their own way. And the event is sometime after the death of the father, something which has to be celebrated through an orthodox ritual which requires the burning of clothes. But everyone is late, stressed, and has their own unique litany of problems. The cinematography is a madness. The camera is usually situated itself in the middle of the flat, allowing people to come and go through doors like they are in a farce. It's shot in such a realist style, however, that we realize that several stories are going on at once, as if the camera is another character watching, picking and choosing what exactly he should be focusing his attention on at any given time. Yet the film contains a family tree that led many critics at the time to say, okay, we don't really know who is actually related to who, but you still see the usual classic characters. The grandmother saying how things were better in the good old days, except for her this means the communist era, an unwelcome, philandering uncle, a prodigal son, a conspiracy theory-obsessed cousin, a rebellious daughter, a wife who just doesn't want to be there, and a random Croatian junkie. It's a fun movie, brimming of life, showing the director at his most tragicomic and entertaining. It shows he could easily make a French comedy if he so desired. There's also a touch of Brunellian absurdity here, something that will extend further into Malmkrog itself. Everybody wants to eat dinner, but they can't until the priest arrives, leading to a series of deeply protracted pleasures. Meanwhile, barely anyone can find the strength to actually mention the dead father himself, preferring to launch into any other conversation possible. Conspiracy theories abound, from one man who believes 9/11 was faked to another who was actually there at the scene, showing that everyone remembers and processes history differently, something that will be very pertinent to the many historical discussions that are present in Malmkrog. There was also the sense of subtext. People will talk about anything other than that which really matters, making one have to focus on what is behind the text as well as the many, many surfaces. Understandably, critics loved this one when it played at Cannes in 2016, with shades of Mike Leigh's Secret and Lies. This is easily his most accessible work after Dough and Stuff. Would fully recommend to any family. Now for some closing statements. The most complimentary thing we can say about Puiu is that his work with actors is simply transfixing. Across his entire filmography, there is not a single false note to be found. There are no phony introductions, no simplistic exposition, no histrionics. This is naturalism of the finest order, topping even the middle-class obsessions of Eric Romer. His long takes are next level good, with actors often being required to go on for tens of minutes at a time, and the fact that they can do so and maintain such a tempo throughout only speaks to Puiu's directing skill. Yet on the other hand, the way one is thrown into scenarios and depressing situations can often be confusing. The family tree of Sierra Nevada requires endless scribblings in a notebook, as do the multifarious arguments that come to the fore in Malmkrog. His anti-narrative impulses, which of course go hand in hand with the observational Wiseman-esque style, are often totally maddening. This is not a critic's darling either. While Lazarescu and Sierra Nevada are critically lauded, Aurora is not loved, and neither really is Malmkrog. But this is part and parcel from a filmmaker who cannot and will not compromise. Some experiments are bound to go too far. On the slow cinema spectrum, which starts with someone who isn't really slow like Tarkovsky or Kubrick, and ends with Lav Diaz or Xiai Miang Ling, who I'm sorry, I just can't watch. He also represents just about as far as I would go before I would actually break and just give up. Aurora nearly did just have me give up, and I admit to looking at my phone during the watch, especially during stretches where he just shoots himself walking around the apartment, or eating a sandwich in his car. But even that film, which I guess plays much differently in a cinema screen, is rewarding, only one really has to put a shift in. These contradictory impulses between exhaustion and enlightenment, beautiful mise-en-scène and static, tiring camera work find a new home in Malmkrog, which represents a new break from the Romanian New Wave and his previous work, yet complement those themes in a fascinating way. Find out more about his latest film in part 2.